from the main course of it, let me just throw some questions to you. Like, for example, since our school days, we have been taught that geography is more about the man and environment relationship, right? So what is exactly about this man and environment relationship that only geography can explain, and something that is unique to geography and which other disciplines might not be able to explain that well? So from this, the understanding is that, for example, different disciplines, for example, sociology, would perhaps see the same relationship from a different perspective, from the sociology, from social relations, from in terms of how the sociology of space it gets created. Similarly, in terms of maybe economics will probably see the economic relations that exist between the man and the environment, and perhaps a historical researcher would see the entire relationship based on the temporal scale. So the idea is like there's something that is very core to geography, and if time is that way associated with history, then we associate space with geography. And this space is actually not something that is a Euclidean space or something that a void can, in terms of the cosmic space or a void, but rather it's a set of relations. And therefore, you need to kind of think it from a perspective of humanistic geography, from a perspective of social geography, because here I'm not talking about the very physical parts of it, but rather on a very political, on a very humanistic notions of space. So if we since we kind of boast of that the geography as a discipline is basically about the art of map making also. So therefore, how do we map this space in terms of the social relations that it kind of embodies? How do we map these social relations? Or for example, because my particular work actually engages with water, so what is it about this concept of water that we engage in while doing the geographical research? Because again, from the school days, what we have learned is there are certain physical and chemical properties. For example, water is H2O. It's a chemical compound. It is colorless. It is tasteless. It's odorless, and it's something that needs to be managed, which has been the part of the water management discourse largely. But the point is, there's also another lens of looking at the same problem, the man-environment relationship, from a different lens altogether. And
Raina,
this is this.
little slow. It's little slow. You're going too fast. Okay. Yeah.
Okay. Acha, so basically what we are talking about is having a different lens. This lens is basically what we call epistemology. Amra jodi research methodology sange kichuta porichito hoi. So epistemology is nothing but আমি একটা নতুন ভাবে I'm using a new perspective of seeing the same thing, right? A new tool of looking at the same research problem. So the idea of this talk is to basically explore these newer avenues within the larger discipline of geography. আর সেটাতেই আমরা নতুন যে পার্সপেক্টিভটার কথা বলছি সেটাই আমরা নাম দিয়েছি হাইড্রোসোশাল জিওগ্রাফিজ। So this is basically a story, and nothing really very scary in it. Basically, how we associate ourselves with water. What is the general discourse around water? মানে জল নিয়ে আমরা সাধারণত কি একটা আইডিয়া আমাদের মধ্যে আছে জেনারেল পাবলিকের মধ্যে, that is what it is in this, and that's basically a storyline. Where what I have done is I have picked up certain headlines from newspapers and have also mentioned the source. So it is basically a fight between two political parties. Like DJB is basically the Delhi Jal Board, which is the state water board for Delhi. And on 8th February 2020, we had the Delhi elections. So as we know, like before the before the elections, what we have is basically a contestation between two parties. Like different election promises are made that we will give you water, we will give you electricity, we will give you this and that. And therefore, what happened is just before the elections, these two parties had a fight over the quality of water or drinking water that is being supplied in Delhi. And the entire argument was that if Delhi government is not able to provide safe drinking water to its residents, to its citizens, then then the government doesn't have the capability to function as a government, right? So therefore, this needs to be they need to be thrown away, and the BJP government needs to be elected. So what happened is there was a claim that was made in the media that a very renowned minister had actually made this claim that all the samples of DJB were found to be unfit for drinking. Now imagine that if in a city the government claims, or government or one of the very popular minister claims that the water that you're having is actually unfit or unhealthy for drinking, and therefore it actually acts as it's very scary, in fact, to have it to kind of realize the fact that every day what you're having is totally not fit for your health. So therefore, this entire discourse was created. This idea of that you're having a bad water was created in the media. And it was also said that Delhi is actually having the most polluted water in terms of drinking water. It went so far that even the Supreme Court had to intervene into it regarding the water quality of it. And lastly, what happened is that Aam Aadmi Party, which was then in the government, they actually made a sample testing of all the waters collected, and they kind of proved that basically the water that they provide is safe. So the idea was that that the entire discourse around water that we generally associate with is basically about the quality. What is the amount of water that is being supplied to the household? What exactly is the standards maintained in terms of provision? So we don't think much about the non-technical part of water. So water might have other meanings also. So that is exactly where the other lens of looking into water comes into play. And therefore, before moving on to the new lens, I would discuss a little bit about the existing lenses. So we all know about hydrological studies, right? I mean, geography is actually something which has an integral part of hydrological discipline. So hydrological studies kind of, it would actually talk about water in terms of management, distribution within the larger Earth systems approach, which is basically the Earth system as a whole. If we kind of look into Earth system as a whole, then it has biosphere, it has atmosphere, it has other important spheres of basically. Shubhadeep? Hello? Can you hear me, Shubhadeep?
Yeah, we hear you.
Okay, yeah.
Actually, somebody has written to
Is
go
this
slow.
okay? Is the speed too much?
Yeah. Please go
Okay.
slowly.
Okay.
Yeah.
So do I need to repeat
বলো,
anything?
আস্তে।
আমাকে কিছু রিপিট করতে হবে? I can repeat that.
না রিপিট করতে হবে না, বাট মানে তুমি যেগুলো বলছো একটু স্লোলি, মানে আস্তে
আচ্ছা,
মানে
ঠিক আছে।
ফাস্ট হয়ে যাচ্ছে টেম্পোটা।
তো hydrological studies যেটা বলে, which is basically the hydrology as we see in terms of geography, মানে earth systems approach এর মাধ্যমে, there what we see is that earth systems as a whole, মানে একটা system এর মাধ্যমে আমরা দেখি where different components are there. For example, there is atmosphere, there is biosphere, there is hydrosphere, and therefore all these spheres interact amongst themselves, and they create a larger systematic approach. But the point is that if we go through this hydrological discipline, what we don't account for is basically the element of social relations, and therefore the socio hydrology was basically a new discipline that came up. Hello.
Yes.
So social hydrology came up as a new discipline, and it was basically the International Association of Hydrological Sciences, the IAHS. They actually designated one scientific decade between 2013 to 2022, which was called the Panta-Rei, which means basically everything flows. It was basically a concept of the Greek philosopher Heraclitus. And what he meant was to advance the science of hydrology for the benefit of society. So what we're trying to do is society and human relations should have some integral relationship with the hydrological system, like water systems, like rivers, like all the technical parts of it should have its implication with the human relations also. So the entire discourse around social hydrology that you find the integral relationship between all its components, and you present a socio-technological approach to water, which means that I mean, every access to water, the problem regarding the access to water can be solved using an engineering solution or a technical solution. And human nature interactions of any kind can be basically modeled using the quantitative models. For example, you can take, for example, every component, like all the hydrological components, like evaporation, like infiltration, then amount of rainfall, what is the flood parameters, and also the human parameters, like what would have been the response on the part of the humans. For example, there's a flood in any river basin, what would be the responses on the part of the humans, right? But the thing is, the entire discourse of social hydrology looks it into a quantitative methodology, in the sense it's a positivist methodology. It kind of pinpoints every component as a component of the mathematical expression, that this plus this will equal to be this, right? And what they do is, in terms of accounting the human perspectives, they use narratives. Like, for example, I am using a certain narrative about my experience in JNU, and therefore that can be added to as a supplement to the entire model part of it. But what is missing in this entire discourse is that of the human subjectivity. Like every human being will have its own decision making, have its own value system, its own agency, and therefore, if we kind of put the entire thing in the model perspective, we cannot calibrate the individual subjectivities. Like আমার সঙ্গে যে মতের মিল হতে পারে শুভদীপে, সেটা আমরা মডেলে ঢোকাতে পারবো না, আমরা যতই ফাইনার ক্যালিব্রেশন সেখানে করি না কেন। So there are some inbuilt power structures which are also there in the society, এবং সেটাকে আমি কখনোই প্যারামিটার হিসেবে ট্রিট করতে পারবো না within the model. So there's also history and the culture of the space, which will define যে আমরা কিভাবে hydrological system গুলোকে we are trying to look at it. So there's also socio-political context, which is basically that perhaps a society of like, for example, in Kolkata, the way we look at things or look at certain knowledge systems is very different from the way the North Indian belt looks at certain things. For example, social relations like caste will be seen in a very different context in case of West Bengal than perhaps in the North Indian belt. This is just a rough example, but I'm trying to say is that the socio-political context will be very important in terms of determining how a person will behave, right? And this was something that the hydrological studies were not literally taking into account for a long period of time. Later on, they started incorporating, and that is how the socio-hydrology came into being. But this was actually different from hydrosocial, because here what we were doing is model থেকে আমরা বাইরে as একটা exogenous relation, exogenous factor হিসেবে আমরা human কে ধরছিলাম যে there will be some sort of a relationship between this hydrological system and the humans, but আমরা তাকে internalize করছিলাম না, মানে মডেলের ভেতরে তাকে as a part দেখছিলাম না। Therefore, what the hydrosocial theory or hydrosocial relationship basically tries to see is it's more of a critical physical geography perspective. Like আমরা যদি ভাবি যে এন্টায়ারলি ওই ফিজিক্যাল ল্যান্ডস্কেপটা বা সোশিও বায়োফিজিক্যাল ল্যান্ডস্কেপটা কিভাবে তৈরি হচ্ছে, মানে শুধুমাত্র মাউন্টেন্স, রিভার্স, অ্যাটমসফিয়ার এভাবে না দেখে আমরা যদি ভাবি সমস্ত ল্যান্ডস্কেপ যেখানে আমরা বসবাস করছি, where we are living is basically a lived space, মানে আমরা সেটাকে এক্সপিরিয়েন্স করছি, তার মধ্যে একটা সোশ্যাল রিলেশন আছে, তার মধ্যে একটা হিউম্যান এলিমেন্ট আছে, and therefore this entire space is produce space. And this was actually one of the philosophical debates in geography, যে কিভাবে আমরা ফিজিক্যাল জিওগ্রাফির মাধ্যমে নতুন ডিবেটস গুলোর সঙ্গে এনগেজ করতে পারবো। And therefore, the need to see water in a different way. As I said, it's not to say that hydrology is irrelevant or to say that it's something that is bad or good, but rather what we say is there's another way of looking at the same thing, which is more of a human perspective, right? So this is where the hydrosocial cycle or hydrosocial relations comes into play. Now, this basically this theory has its roots in the political ecology literature. যেটার মানে হচ্ছে যে আমরা নেচারকে, মানে অর্থাৎ এনভায়রনমেন্ট যেটা ছিল ম্যান এন্ড এনভায়রনমেন্টে, দিস এনভায়রনমেন্টকে আমরা পলিটিক্যালি দেখার চেষ্টা করছি। মানে আমরা ভাবছি যে নেচার ইটসেলফ একটা এজেন্সি আছে, এবং সেটাকে যখন হিউম্যান এলিমেন্ট দ্বারা আমি সেটাকে মডিফাই করছি, দেন দ্যাট বিকামস পলিটিসাইজড, বিকজ আমার একটা নিজস্ব পলিটিক্স আছে, আমি সেটাকে, এই পলিটিক্স কিন্তু ইলেকট্রাল পলিটিক্স এর থেকে খুব আলাদা। ইটস নট অ্যাবাউট পার্টি পলিটিক্স অর সামথিং লাইক। হ্যাঁ বল।
Just one I'm interrupting you. Please don't use Bengali in between, because there are people here who don't know Bengali.
Okay. So basically the thing that hydrosocial relations, it has its roots in the political ecology literature, which is basically that you see nature in a very politicized manner, which means that nature itself will have an agency, and the humans will actually modify this nature to have a new produced nature, which is basically that suppose we are having like a river, the river is flowing down, but the moment it enters into cities or, for example, any rural space also, we are kind of modifying that river space. It doesn't remain a natural river anymore. We may say that it's still it's a very virgin river, it's a beautiful landscape, but still it has implications in terms of the anthropologic influences on it, right? And therefore what we are trying to do is to find the political influences on it, and how the social fault lines comes into play in terms of how the space gets produced. So this kind of a approach is more context specific, like it kind of takes into account where I'm coming from, to which socio-cultural background that I belong, and how this relationship will change with the changing backdrop with the hydrological system. Like what kind of water management system I will choose will kind of be dependent upon the kind of background that I come from. So for example, in a tribal society, you won't really preach that why don't you do a water harvesting or a rainwater harvesting system, because in their culture that thing is quite, I mean, it might be there, but in their own way of doing it will be very different from the way a Kolkata guy might be doing it, right? So this social cultural context and the politics behind it kind of determines how we engage with water. So these are kind of the thematic intersections from the literature only. So if you want, you can actually read up the literature on hydrosocial, and this it's basically a summary of the entire literature. So what it calls about that water will have its multiple meanings instead of only one notion of H2O. So modern water is basically the homogenized water, which kind of is very standardized. Like it should have this properties, this qualities. It should be safe. It should be, like, for example, drinking water. It should have this amount of like all the bacterial properties should be only of this amount. Otherwise, it's unfit for drinking. But the point is that the meanings of water would be very different for different individuals. The reason why I say this is in the sense that suppose in case of a researcher comes from outside of India, and he comes to River Hooghly and tests the water samples, and he finds that it's completely unfit for bathing, right? But the point is that for us, Hooghly is a it's very pure. It is still, so it has a religious angle to it, and therefore we will still engage with that water. We will still use the Ganga Jal that is there, and we won't consider it as unfit for or very very polluted or something like that. So the change is from a very one singular notion of water to multiple meanings of it, and therefore the shift from hydrological cycle to hydrosocial cycle. And here what we say is that water and social are not separate from each other, but they are co-constituting of each other. And therefore also the questions of social justice and like who gets where, what, and how, these questions come into play. Where exactly lies the power? What are the societal fault lines? Who will have more access? Who will have more privilege in terms of accessing water? Who will be more at a more disadvantageous position? And therefore also the decision making power lies to certain this privileged class, right? So who will govern the hydrological systems? So these are questions that are kind of addressed by this hydrosocial literature. And next we move on to the space, because as I said, it started off with what is space and society relationships. So the space here is more of a social construct also, right? So should I don't know, I mean, should I say in Bangla?
না ঠিক আছে, তুমি বলো, মানে যেভাবে বলছিলে বলো, বাইলিঙ্গুয়ালি বলো, আমি সেটাই বলছি।
আচ্ছা, so the space here is basically a social construct, which means that the space will have its agency, the space will have its own relationship, and it will kind of affect the other the elements that are present within the space. For example, suppose a space like Kolkata is not a space, it's a physical space nonetheless, but because of its people, because of its lived experience, because of its history, the colonial history, the present history, its politics, it will have a new character of its own. তো মানে আমরা আমরা স্পেসটাকে একটা
হ্যালো রায়না দি, হ্যালো, we can't hear you.
জাস্ট জিওমেট্রিক ডাইমেনশনে দেখছি না,
কানেকশনটা একটু গন্ডগোল হচ্ছিল একটু আগে।
এখন শোনা যাচ্ছে?
এখন ঠিক আছে, এখন ঠিক আছে, হ্যাঁ বলো। স্পেস থেকে শুরু করো, মানে how you are defining যেটা বলছিলে তুমি।
আচ্ছা, আমি না ওই চ্যাট বক্সটা দেখতে পাচ্ছি না, সুবিলি মানে একটু বলবি যে আমি বাংলায় বললে অসুবিধা, মানে বাংলা ইংলিশ মিলিয়ে বলবো।
শ্রমিক যেহেতু একটু পরে জয়েন করেছিল, তো ও ওই স্কিমাটা জানতো না, সেজন্য বলেছিল যে ইংলিশ। আর তুমি যেভাবে বাংলা এন্ড ইংলিশ বোথ চালাচ্ছিলে, দ্যাট ইজ ওকে, আই থিংক।
আচ্ছা,
তো গো অ্যাহেড।
ঠিক আছে, ওকে।
কারণ ব্যাপারটা হচ্ছে যে জিনিসগুলো নিয়ে আমরা ডিসকাস করছি, মানে ওয়েস্ট বেঙ্গলের কলেজ বা ইউনিভার্সিটিতে সেই বিষয়গুলো অতটা ডিসকাশন হয় না। সো বেসিক্যালি it would be little মানে overarching maybe for them, because there are people from UG and PG. So
আমার মনে হয় যে মানে লেট মি জাস্ট সুইচ বিটুইন বাংলা এন্ড ইংলিশ, যেখানে অসুবিধা হবে পরে চ্যাট বক্সে ইউ ক্যান রাইট টু মি, আমি সেটাকে আবার বাংলাতে এক্সপ্লেন করে দেবো। আই থিঙ্ক দ্যাট উড বি আ বেটার ওয়ে টু go about.
Okay.
So তো স্পেসের যে ক্ষেত্রে, স্পেস is basically, as I was mentioning, it's a social construct, and space will have its own set of relationships. Space will affect the elements that it contains. মানে আমি এক্সাম্পল দিচ্ছিলাম যে আমরা যখন বলি যে আমরা কলকাতা যাচ্ছি, সো কলকাতা itself is a sense of place, আমাদের মনে একটা বড় শহর, হ্যাঁ, সেই বড় শহর is qualitatively different from any other cities of West Bengal. সেটা আমাদের ধারণা, আমাদের মনে হয়, which is basically a perception, right? So why is it that we have this perception? It's because of the at a urbanization at a scale ache Kolkataর মধ্যে, there are a lot of people at a population angle ache, and all of this kind of makes us think that Kolkata is a very big city and it has a enigma of its own. But the thing is, it's also because of its history, it also because of its politics, that the way it kind of exerts its power in the West Bengal circle, that we kind of automatically think about it as a very, very influential city. So space will have its agency to influence the power it generates also. And therefore, the space will also create certain spatial inequalities. মানে একটা স্পেস, ধর স্পেস এ আর একটা স্পেস বি, এই দুটো জায়গার যে পাওয়ার জেনারেট করার ক্ষমতা থাকবে, মানে একটা শহর হয়তো বর্ধমানের মতো একটা শহর, বা একটা হচ্ছে কলকাতার মতো শহর, তো এটার মধ্যে কোয়ালিটেটিভলি আমাদের ধারণা হবে যে Kolkata will have its more influence. আমি এটাকে অবজেক্টিভলি বলছি না, but it's a subjective perception. So at the same time, when the spatial inequalities come into play, what happens? These are uneven geographical spaces, right? So one space is more powerful than the other, and therefore the relationship, the social relationships that exist within these spaces will also be uneven. So in terms of water, in terms of seeing it through the hydrosocial relations, this ability to access to water will also differ across spaces or groups of people. Like some spaces will have more access to water, some spaces will have less access to water. So then comes the role of state, because when we talk about social relations, there's also the body politic of state. State in the sense which is basically institutions, the practices that the body of state kind of performs, the acts, the different legal acts, schemes and policies, and the way it governs on the population. So it will also have a boundary. For example, we can have ward boundaries, we can have territorial boundaries like that of a suppose Greater Kolkata Development Authority. We can have a planning boundary also. And then we can also have categories of space or people. Like, for example, in case of Delhi, we have categories of housing. Like these are authorized colonies, legal colonies. These are planned colonies. These are completely unauthorized colonies, or these are slums. On the basis of these legalities, what the state does is that it will provide certain basic amenities to certain colonies and it won't to other. So this is basically the politics of the state, and it will kind of affect also the claims that are made by the people to these basic amenities. So it will also decide the kind of project. For example, if your colony doesn't have a pipe water supply, you have to actually make a claim to the state. মানে আমাকে state কে বলতে হবে যে আজকে আমার কাছে জল আসছে না. State will make a provision for a pipeline or extensive pipeline supply, and it will actually give you the provision of water. But the point is, এই যে আমি access টা পাচ্ছি, is it enough for my locality, or is the pressure enough? Is the amount that is being supplied enough? Or the quality is enough? So these are other aspects of the access which basically these hydrological studies don't take into account. So when we talk about hydrosocial geographies, I explain the hydrosocial part of it, and geography if I take into account the space part of it. So this hydrosocial geography altogether would be basically the water, space, society, institutions, technology, history, culture, power, and the entirety of it, the entire contradictions that exist between them, and also the relationships that exist between them. And the way I kind of explain this is through one of my case studies that I did during my MPhil. So this was basically the master plan of Delhi actually designates what would be the use of every space. মানে master plan is basically a legal document, okay, and it kind of designates যে কোন কাজ কোথায় হবে একটা শহরের মধ্যে. And this is basically at a perspective plan, মানে around 20 বছর, মানে 20 years এর perspective plan হয়, যে আমি 20 বছর বাদে কিরকম শহরটাকে দেখতে চাই, সে কি পার্সপেক্টিভে দেখতে চাই. So that is how the planning bodies plan this, make these maps. So the same way, Delhi has its master plan and it designates certain zones as this would be the residential zone. This would be basically the industrial zone. This would be more of the Yamuna plains. So this way it kind of designates different areas. So one such part was called Shahjahanabad, which is basically a historic city, and it also has mixed usage. The Shahjahanabad is basically the area which kind of encompasses the Red Fort area, then the Jama Masjid area, which is old Delhi part, which is very congested. I mean, think of any old cities of the country, and it's very congested. It has a mixed use, like it has residential uses, plus there's a lot of shops. So it's basically a chock-a-block thing there. And to supply water, to supply pipelines to this kind of a very congested area is basically a headache for the state. So what happens is, hello?
Yeah, tell me.
It's fine, right? Okay.
Go ahead.
So basically what happens in case of any historic cities, it becomes very difficult to upgrade. মানে যদি কখনো কোনো সমস্যা হয়, মানে আমাদের সমস্যা in the sense water crisis এর যদি কোনো problem হয়, বা if you're facing any scarcity but lack of water supply, then it's very difficult for the state to upgrade the thing. The infrastructural upgradation becomes very difficult because of the fact that the space, the physical space of it is very congested. So the same thing happens in case of Shahjahanabad. It's a very old city. It's basically of the Mughal times. So that is how the name comes, Shahjahanabad, basically the abode of Shah Jahan. And what happens is it has a history to it, like how the space was organized there, where the water would come from. And interestingly, the Jamuna river that lies just next to Shahjahanabad, the entire settlement. And the interesting point is that for Shahjahanabad, this Yamuna was never the source of drinking water. What they did was they had to actually build canals, because it's a system of Mughal canals is a very famous, I mean, we all know about it. So Mughal canals were built to bring water from as far as Haryana or from other states like Himachal Pradesh sides and everything, so that they could have the fresh water supply to the city. And this is something that is even practiced today, although in a different form, but this is practiced even today. So what I want to see is that how exactly do we see this hydrosocial relations or hydrosocial geographies playing out? And the case study that I take is basically the piped water supply for drinking water. Potable means drinking water basically, and that too in a planned colony, because otherwise what the state argues is that if it's a slum, then the state kind of rejects its responsibilities. It says that because you're illegal colony, I won't give certain benefits to you. মানে যেটা আমাদের এখানে যে কোনো জায়গায় আমাদের পশ্চিমবঙ্গতে কোনো বস্তি বা কোথাও যেগুলো ইললিগাল কলোনি হিসেবে খাতায় কলমে স্টেটের ইললিগাল, সেগুলোকে স্টেট বেসিক্যালি প্রোভাইড করে না, মানে ইলেকট্রিসিটি হোক বা জল হোক, আদার বেসিক অ্যামিনিটিস, দে অ্যাকচুয়ালি don't provide all this stuff. So the thing is that the entire hypothesis jeta ami bolar chesta korchi, that is basically what happens when it's a planned colony, which means that the state is bound to give water supply to these colonies. So how is the access mediated in such colonies, and what happens in terms of seeing the entire scenario through hydrosocial geographical point of view? And what I take into account are basically the legalities, the urban planning documents, how the negotiation with each of the spatial politics takes place. So I'm going to show a couple of maps and photos just to end my presentation. And I think if you have any confusions regarding the conceptual part, you can actually write in the chat box. I will explain to you. So this is basically a schematic diagram that I've prepared, and it's based on the MPhil only. So for example, if I take the case study of potable water, the drinking water supply. So what we have is the water needs to be produced. The drinking water, to make it fit for drinking, you need to have that water from the rivers, which is nature, and then you'd make it potable. It's basically to comply with the standards that are there to make it fit for drinking. So what you do is you put nature, which is a river, you have a labor, which is basically physical labor who are making this pipelines, who are drawing this water from the reservoirs and dams. And then there's capital, which is basically funding to make this infrastructural project. There's technology, so which are the engineering solutions. And then what we have, this nature part of it is basically water from different rivers, dams, and reservoirs. For example, for Delhi, it doesn't have the water of its own. So what it does, it brings water from the dams of Bhakra Nangal. Then it brings like water from Tehri Dam, which is in Uttarakhand. So this is the way the entire water supply system or water distribution system of Delhi works. So together with all of this nature, labor, capital, and technology, what we make are the hydraulic infrastructures. Hydraulic money, there's an engineering part of it. So together there's a labor capital part of it, and there's also a natural technological part of it. So together we make this hydraulic infrastructures. For example, this pipelines, this water treatment plants. So you bring that water out of the rivers and bring them into the water treatment plants. Then you treat them, you chlorinate them, you make it like fit for drinking. And what you do is then supply the water that is being treated to the individual colonies in the cities, which is basically the pipe water network distribution of the pipe water supply. Then what happens is that for each of these colonies, if you consider each of the wards maybe, or whatever geographical space you want to imagine, like এক একটা ward হোক, এক একটা colony হোক, একটা locality হোক, it will have its own urban material spaces, which are basically the physical spaces. মানে তার একটা প্ল্যান থাকবে, সেটেলমেন্ট প্ল্যান থাকবে, তার একটা আর্কিটেকচার থাকবে, তার অর্গানাইজেশন থাকবে, সে কতটা লাইক লেভেল অব্দি সে বাড়িটা তুলতে পারে, মানে আমরা বলি না 3 তলা 4 তলা বাড়ি. So all these legalities will be there in terms of defining what is the urban material space. Then there are also the old and the new water infrastructures. And this is important because I am talking about a historic city. So this will be true also in case of Kolkata, because it also has in case of many of the cities in West Bengal, because it has a colonial history also. And next, what comes is the people and the lived spaces, because every day the people will negotiate those legal documents or legalities that are present, and they will create newer spaces. And as I said, each of these spaces will have different power relationships. So space A will have more access to water maybe than space B. This is a hypothetical scenario I'm talking about, but this is what happens in reality also. So this everyday negotiations between the people and the state in terms of accessing water will create new spaces, which are basically the relationship between the water, society, and space. So state, hello? Thank you. So state kind of helps in terms of governance, in terms of governing the entire the hydrosocial system that we're talking about, the infrastructure, how the people will access water, what amount of water will be given to what colony. So everything is being decided by the state. So together what we have, this entire relationship kind of brings up a new space. This is a produce space, which kind of interacts between the ones that are on pen and paper, which is the plans, a master plan হোক বা যে কোনো প্ল্যানিং ডকুমেন্ট হোক, সেটার সঙ্গে the everyday experience, মানে আমি প্রত্যেকদিন যেভাবে আমি lived experience গুলোকে তৈরি করছি, how I am actually mediating this access to water. মানে প্রত্যেকদিন আমার ট্যাপটা খুললে কি জলটা পড়ছে, নাকি আমার তার জন্য আরো অ্যাডিশনাল কিছু মেকানিজম তৈরি করতে হচ্ছে। যেমন আমি ট্যাঙ্কে জল ভরে রাখতে পারি, হয়তো আমার আজকে 7টায় জল আসার কথা, বাট আমি কোনোভাবে সেটা মিস করলাম, তো আমি সকাল থেকে জলটা ভরে রাখবো, তাই তো? বা আমি পাম্প ইউজ করলাম যাতে আমার প্রেশারটাকে যাতে আমি কাউন্টার করতে পারি, মানে হয়তো প্রেশারের কিছু প্রবলেম আছে, সো হোয়াট আই ডু ইজ আই পাম্প ইট আপ যাতে আমার 4তলার ফ্ল্যাটে গিয়েও জলটা পৌঁছয়। So these are the mechanisms that every day people do in order to mediate their access. So this entire thing can be called as the hydrosocial relations within the space. So for example, এবার আমি history partটায় যাচ্ছি, because that will decide the politics of the space right now. So how is the space produced? মানে in case of this map, what it is basically a historical map, antique map that was a hand-drawn map, and over that what I have done is superimpose the drainage of Delhi, which was there historically. So you see the Yamuna, which was there. You see its branches also, a couple of jheels which have now been actually reduced to nalas. And this is basically the Shahjahanabad, the city of Shahjahanabad. And this entire part will, this settlement will be a part of the master plan. Okay. So these are all the 7 cities, because I mean, if you read the literature on Delhi, there were basically 7 historical cities in case of Delhi, and Shahjahanabad was the most modern one. Modern why? Because it had the best of the infrastructure and engineering things that were in place in terms of water, in terms of like other like infrastructural facilities that were there. So this was basically the Western Yamuna Canal, which used to bring water from Haryana, as I said. And this Yamuna, which we see today, was never the source of drinking water, even though it was very close to the Shahjahanabad city. And this is another part of it, which is basically the Baulis or the wells. The Baulis is basically a historic term only, or it's a colloquial term, which means these are the wells or these are the tanks that were there. And so basically, apart from this, the canal that used to bring water, what were there? Plenty of wells, because this lies entirely in the Yamuna plains. So Yamuna flood bank jeta chilo, tar moddhei jehetu ei cityটা construct করা হয়েছিল, তাই অসংখ্য wells was basically the main source of drinking water for them. So if we see today, we cannot actually depend entirely upon the network pipe supply as its only source of drinking water for the city, because তাদের একটা history আছে, সেই historical যে infrastructure গুলো ছিল বা যে মানে water access এর যে মাধ্যমগুলো ছিল সেগুলো এখনো থাকবে. The idea is to see whether they're still using it, and state supply এর সঙ্গে what the role is playing, what is the role played by these infrastructures. So this is basically the present mechanism. I was already talking about how water is being brought from the different reservoirs. For example, this is Bhakra Nangal Dam. তো এখান থেকে জলটাকে নিয়ে আসা হয় ক্যানেলের মাধ্যমে. There's also এখানে এটা হিমাচল প্রদেশের মধ্যে পড়বে. This is Tehri Dam. This is Uttarakhand section. So all of this water is being actually brought to the city of Delhi so that the residents can have water. Otherwise, Delhi doesn't have a water of its own. So entirely, the nature that we were talking about is not nature anymore. We're basically producing that nature through a social part of it and a technological part of it. So এটাকে বলা হয় socio-nature. Okay. And these are the pictures that I am going to show through like how exactly the access gets mediated on an everyday basis. So as I was saying, since it's a historical city, it will have certain very old or indigenous modes of access to drinking water. For example, this picture is basically that of these are called the mashaks. Mashaks are basically the goat skin, and these are basically for the water carriers. The Bhishtis are a tribe. They used to historically carry water to all the shopkeepers and the residents there. And this entire the dargah, the Hare Bhare Shah Dargah, is basically next to the Jama Masjid area, and it has a huge well. But the well is not in use anymore. The only work that the Bhishtis do, currently, is basically they feed they use this water from the wells to kind of wash the front portions of the shopkeepers during the summer months, because they need water. So otherwise, this historically was one of the sources of drinking water for the locality of Shahjahanabad. Then we have this Baulis, which I said these are the wells, and these are inside the masjids also. So every masjid almost have a small or a large well, and they used to actually have water from these wells. Next, what happened? When this Baulis could not be, because the water level went down, what happened? After the state came into the scene, they actually connected their municipal connection with this the Baulis. And right now, even now, the corporation water comes along with this Bauli water. So there's a fusion of the old and the new infrastructure. And then we have the Piaus. Piaus are nothing but the Jol Chhatra, what we locally call. So the water dispensing units. So these also have the connections with the main corporation supply, and that is from where people can, because there are many shops and many residential places, so they can have this community access to the water. And these are again the water-filled earthen pots. This can be seen even in West Bengal circle. So these are the different indigenous modes, the old modes of drinking water. Then we have the newer modes, which are the newer infrastructures that have been put into place by the state or by the people themselves. So because it's also the tourist area, as I said, it's a Red Fort ache sekhane, Jama Masjid ache, but overall aro onek sekhane tourist locations ache. So there are these water pouches that are being sold for the people, but these are very tiny pouches. We also have the jerrycans, which are like 20 liter jerrycan, but 30 liter jerrycan, which are also being sold. And then we have the problem of, as I was saying, the congestion, because the space has been historically a very congested space. So সেখানে আর সম্ভব না, our infrastructural upgradation সেখানে possible না, because it's just not possible to have or add more pipelines into that space. So what they do is the people themselves, using a local plumber, আমার যদি কোনো চেনা plumber থাকে, তাকে ডেকে আমি just বললাম যে you just like যেমন ভাবে হুকিং হয় ইলেকট্রিসিটির, সেরকম ভাবে মেইন পাইপলাইন থেকে একটা ছোট পাইপ লাগিয়ে আমি সেখান থেকে জলটাকে নিয়ে এলাম। সো বেসিক্যালি আই এম ইউজিং ফিডার পাইপলাইন্স to tap the main channel so that my supply is sufficient. So this is why what they do is like main state supply comes. Along with that, they also have the borings, and also the submersible connections are there, so that their own needs are being met. And you can see this is basically called a spaghetti system of pipelines, because it's like a mess. Like every pipeline is connected to every other pipeline, and what happens as a result of this is that there are frequent issues with the pressure, because since main active channel theke we are actually tapping the water, so and the flow is constant, right? The state is supplying us standard amount of water, and if I kind of hook from the main tap, so the supply and the pressure kind of gets distributed. So this is a problem, and many of these old areas of like Delhi, like in Shahjahanabad, actually faces problem of pressure. Or sometimes what happens is that impurities go into it, because the moment you have pressure issues, uh, since there's a void that happens, which is basically a technical part of it, যেহেতু ওখানে গ্যাপটা হয়ে যায়, হাওয়া ঢুকে যায়, তার জন্য অনেক impurities সেখানে suck in হয়ে যায়, and therefore what happens, the people get dirty water. So the main complaints that the state gets from these localities are that they're having issues with the pressure, they're having issues with the quality of water. But this is something that they need to do, because otherwise the amount of water that is being supplied is not sufficient to meet their needs. Then we also have certain like lower income categories which are there within the plant colonies. For example, this was called the Daya Basti. So this, because they don't have that affordability, or they don't have the money to kind of go for this large pipelines or maybe tanks or like pumps and everything. So what they do is they have a state supply, which is basically this tap, which is a time call, what we say in Bangla. So this time call is there, and time call থেকে যখন যখন time supply আসে স্টেটের, for example সকালবেলা একটা 7টা থেকে 8টা, 7 to 8 there's a supply, or in the evening there's a supply from 5 to 7. So this 2 hours of state supply is completely they're dependent upon. And because they don't have this additional infrastructural facilities like that of tanks where they can store the water, they have to depend only on that. So here comes a like politics of space. So these spaces are relatively more richer than this Basti space, and therefore the Basti people cannot have more access to water because of this constraint of economic constraint, the social constraint, as well as the spatial constraint, right? So the last part of it, which kind of like it's a more of a technical part, which this he was an engineer at the Ramlila underground reservoir. So underground reservoir is basically that suppose you have a water treatment plant from there, which is a main source of water production. From there, this water is being sent to different underground reservoirs, which are basically storage tanks for the state. I mean, large storage tanks, underground reservoirs. And from there, they send it to the booster pumping stations. Like you suck in from there, and then you kind of feed it to different smaller channels, so that each channel can go into smaller gullies or localities or neighborhoods. So he was trying to explain to me what is exactly this network of the entire system. But interestingly, this map is, as you can see, it's all torn. মানে এটা কত পুরনো ম্যাপ কেউ জানে না, উনি নিজেই খুলে আমাকে দেখাচ্ছিলেন যে this is the master plan of the technical. But honestly, even they know that right now this is not exactly the map that is in place on the ground, because people have actually made additional connections there, and they have not even informed the state. মানে আমরা অনেক সময় যখন মানে আমাদের জল আসে না, আমরা যখন বলি যে নতুন একটা কানেকশন আমরা করিয়ে নিয়েছি, that is not a very legal way of doing that, because আমরা সেটাকে জাস্ট নিজেদের যে প্রয়োজনটা আছে সেটাকে মেটানোর জন্য আমরা করছি। সো ইন দ্যাট সেন্স যে মাস্টার প্ল্যান অফ টেকনিক্যাল ইঞ্জিনিয়ারিং মাস্টার প্ল্যানটা আছে সেটার মধ্যে অনেক লাইন্স পড়বেই না, ফলে তারা যখন কাউন্টার করছে দ্য প্রেশার ইস্যুস অর দ্য কোয়ালিটি ইস্যুস, দে আর নট এবল টু ফাইন্ড আউট যে নতুন কানেকশন গুলো কোথা থেকে আসছে, বিকজ অন দেয়ার রেকর্ড দ্য কানেকশন ইজ নট দেয়ার. So this is how the state also engages with people, and as a punishment, what they do is like they impose fines on the people. They cut their connections, because Delhiর মতো জায়গায় সেখানে metered connection আছে, অর্থাৎ তারা যতটা জল ইউজ করবে সেই হিসাবে they have to pay their bills also. So in that sense, they cut their connections also as a kind of fine to that. So these are the ways that state also engages with the people on an everyday basis. So if I kind of like look into the hydrosocial geography point of view, I would be looking into the people, the space, the societal fault lines that are there, as well as the technology that is kind of determining the access to this water supply. So entirety of it gives me the hydrosocial relations, which wouldn't have been possible if I was only using a very hydrological or a modeling kind of point of view. And even to look into from the water demand perspective, like কোন লোকালিটির কত ডিমান্ড আছে বা কত স্টেট সাপ্লাই করছে, সেইভাবে আমি যদি দেখতাম তাহলে আই wouldn't have found these nitty-gritties of very ছোট ছোট ফাইনার যে আমি ডিটেলস গুলো পাচ্ছি সেটা আমি ওইভাবে পড়াশোনা করলে পারতাম না. So this is how I end the